So this is the class 1 + 1 + 1 = always. And we're talking about marriage lived out in covenant. And we've already said quite a bit, but we'll keep on going. And what we'll try to do is maybe Silvia and I, what we can do is we can take the first part and we can try to record that and somehow splice this all together, as we really do feel like all of this is going to be really helpful. That's our hope and prayer. So I had mentioned Matthew 19 earlier, Matthew 19:6, and it's really a passage where Jesus is talking about, he's commenting on divorce, and so it's really Jesus on sort of the enduring nature, his comments on the enduring nature, the lasting nature of marriage. And that's the text where Jesus says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And there's a lot to that statement. We may end up talking about that some more next week, but really what it is, it's basically, in its essence, it's just a clear statement of a divine, sort of a divine human reality. I mean, Jesus is just stating something that it is what it is. And in that, there's also a bit of a warning as well. But basically what he's saying is, God has joined us together. It's not just me and Silvia that have made this decision to come together and, live in a marriage relationship, for the rest of our lives. Jesus says that God has done this. There's something happens in this three-way covenant where God actually joins us and he seals this thing. And what Jesus is getting at is, because God has done this, man does not have the right or the authority to change this.
In a contract, if two persons agree to change the terms or dissolve the agreement, they can legally do so. But this covenant that we are talking here, the marriage covenant, is a three-person covenant, and God is the majority stakeholder.
Yeah, that's the lawyer of the family speaking. So Silvia referred to God as being the majority stakeholder, and the truth is, when you think about it, God, in our marriage, God actually has more at stake, believe it or not, than we do. And we have a lot at stake in this marriage. But if it were just about us, if it were just about Silvia and about me, then if we were to dishonor our marriage, or disrespect each other, dishonor one another, neglect the marriage, betray the relationship, it's terrible. But it's our names, it's our lives, it's our families, and maybe some others, in our case, maybe some people in the church or whatever. But there's limits to who is affected by all this and how they are affected. But when God puts his name on this relationship, when God puts not just his name, but his life into this relationship, then it's also his name. When we get in there and we dishonor and we disrespect and we betray and all that, when we neglect, it's his name that's dishonored. And it's his plans and his purposes that are hindered. It's his miracle. And we're going to talk about that more next week, the miracle of marriage. But it's his miracle that is ruined, and it's his testimony to all of heaven and earth that is tarnished. So you might recall with one of the classes by the Pinedas, and of course some of the things that the Deems talked about last week, just referring to the purposes of marriage. And part of the purpose of marriage is to show God. It's to reveal God. It's to demonstrate in a powerful way, the bringing of these two different people together. It's to demonstrate, God's power and his purposes, and it's to usher in, his nature and his character into our lives, and then through us into the world. Marriage is supposed to be like this conduit for bringing the heart and the character and the nature and the will of God into our lives. And it's the very covenant that affirms, it's the very marriage covenant that affirms this truth. So let's talk a little bit more about living marriage in the presence of God, so we can get a better idea of what this means and what it looks like and how do we do it, and then even ask ourselves the question, are we willing to do it? And there are a lot of scriptures, and this could be some good homework. There are a lot of scriptures that describe our posture and how it should be when we're in God's presence. I'm just talking about me and God. So think about that when we talk about marriage.
Yeah, my father was very authoritarian, and when he was at home, me and my 3 siblings would not dare to do anything to provoke him. We were angels when he was at home, but when we were by ourselves, oh my, we were 4 wild, crazy children. My mom did not have our attention or respect to make us obey her. So in the same way, we don't, if we don't have the conviction that we are always in the presence of God, we can be just like this in our homes with our spouse when there is no one watching us. We are disobedient. We can be disobedient to God. We can dishonor him. We can displease him when we don't live with his presence, when we don't live with the conscience that he is here, he is in the room. Fear and reverence for him makes all difference in how we treat each other and how we allowed what we allowed in our mind and heart. So it helps a lot to practice saying to yourself, when we start an argument with our spouse, God is here. He's hearing you, Silvia. He's seeing your face. He's seeing your thoughts. So consider God.
So we're starting to get a little bit practical, a little bit more practical here. And we guys, we actually do this. Silvia and I actually do this, and we've actually had these kinds of conversations. I mean, it's great when I can remember, wait a minute, okay, God is here. I gotta be, but sometimes Silvia's the one that has to remind me, John, God is here. John, do you realize God is present here? And we've actually done that with each other more than once. So you can write down, just to study out, you can write down Ephesians 5 verses 21 through 33. You can write that down so you can read it. But it's verse 21. This is that text it begins a whole section in the letter of the Ephesians. It begins a whole section of instructions to Christian households. That whole section begins before Paul starts talking about marriages and parents and children. It's verse 21 says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. The whole idea of reverence before God as we go about living our relationship with each other. So we're going to talk about living in the presence of God, and we're going to mention three areas.
Yeah, 3 areas. The first one, how we communicate with one another. Communication is all about how we listen, how we express ourselves carefully, thoughtfully, respectfully, reverently, godly, always aware that God is here.
So there you go. When you start thinking about God being present, it will radically transform the communication that you have with your spouse, or it should. It should radically, and we'll actually mention it. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. So So one area that this should radically transform is how we communicate with each other. The other area that it should radically transform and it should impact every day are the attitudes and the thoughts that we harbor in our hearts and in our minds. Silvia just referred to that. If I believe that God is present, if I'm aware that God is present, then whatever I'm thinking, whatever I'm feeling, whatever attitude I'm carrying, I should also be aware that God is aware. You know what I mean? If I'm aware of it, if I'm aware of this attitude that I have, or if I'm aware of this thought that I have that is not good at all, then I'm also aware that God at this very moment is aware of it as well. You know, Hebrews 4 verses 12 and 13, it talks about, you know, we live our lives. I mean, everything is laid bare before God. And it talks about the thoughts. It talks about the actual thoughts and attitudes of our hearts. It's all out there for God to see. And I know that. And so living in God's presence means that I address those thoughts and I address those attitudes ASAP. I don't nurture them. I don't try to just ignore them or sweep them under the rug or hide them, or which is what happens. I read this book. It's actually a really good read, but a number of years ago I read this book, and the name of the book is called Respectable Sins. Respectable Sins, and the author he talks about. He actually, it's sort of a critique on quote unquote Christians and how we live. And he talks about how sadly so many Christians, they deal with the outside of the cup, but they don't deal with the inside. They don't deal with the thoughts and the attitudes. They don't deal with the thought world. They don't deal, and what we do is we tolerate a lot of stuff in our relationship. We can tolerate a lot of stuff. I'm feeling a grudge, or I'm feeling angry, or or I've got these thoughts and they're not righteous, or whatever. And we end up, sadly, what can happen is you can learn to live with those things, or you end up nurturing some of those things, or even trying to justify some of those things. I mean, we've sat with couples and talked about things like that, only to hear people kind of come back and defend themselves, saying things like, well, that's just the way I am, or that's how I'm wired, you know, or that's the baggage that I carry, and he or she just has to learn to live with it, or that's the way I think, or that's my personality, or whatever. And really what that reveals is that there are things going on at a deeper level that we are really not trying to deal with as we live our marriage out in God's presence. If God is here present in our marriage and invested in our marriage, what that means is God also is at work and wants to be at work in purifying and sanctifying and healing each of us, so that we can be what we need to be for each other and for Him. The next area that we want to talk about is marital dissatisfaction. You know, where we get to a point in our marriage, for whatever reason, it could be a phase, it could be a season, it could be a moment, but we get to a moment where we're just not satisfied with our marriage, and we're not getting the satisfaction we feel we need to get, or we would like to get, from our marriage relationship. And I have to say this is inevitable. And what I mean is, every marriage is going to go through this, either in a stage or in a moment or whatever. So this is inevitable. But the real question is, how do we deal with it when we begin to experience it? How is it that we deal with it? And again, it all has to do with living our marriage, this 3-person covenant relationship, living it, learning to live our marriage in the presence of God. So where am I going with this? Well, if I'm beginning to feel dissatisfaction in my marriage, where do I begin? Well, where I begin is I go to God. That's where I go. We call on the 3rd person of our covenant relationship. We invoke Him. we call on him. It's like, God, I need you, or God, we need you. Lord, come and help us here. And let me make this clear. The prayer, this is to me, it's important. The prayer isn't necessarily God, come and fix our problem. You know, that's not necessarily the prayer. It's more of a prayer, or at least part of this prayer is for my marital dissatisfaction to be filled by God himself. And Doug and Ann spoke about this last week beautifully. You know, the whole idea that man, we were never meant, another human being was never meant to be my all and all and all. That place, biblically, that hole, that void has always been meant. We're designed, that's always been meant to be filled by God. The problem comes when I expect my spouse to fill me. I expect her, or I expect him to fill me. And then what happens when, for whatever reason, they're not satisfying me? I mean, that could be their problem, it could be my problem. But the point is where do we go? How do we deal with this? And the starting point is we go to God and we go, God, please fill me. You are the one that fills me. That reveals something. It should actually reveal something even to me about God in my life. And of course, God will answer that prayer, because once again, he is a willing, wholehearted participant in this relationship that we have. And so just as the design of marriage alone, you know, this three-way covenant should be sufficient evidence to show that our individual and collective satisfaction was never designed to be filled by God alone. Just the evidence of that in a practical way, that's the way it works. God is here, and God always needs to be a part of that. So there are a few mistakes that we make that I believe Silvia is going to touch on, or at least touch on one of them. God is the biggest part of all this. Mm-hmm.
The young married couple mistake. The children come, and certainly
this is the
that's that I was going to share. No.
Was
okay.
Oh yeah. This is I was going to share. I'm sorry, guys. But see how we're resolving this, the harmony, the beauty of all this. This is there's the young couple mistake. The young couple mistake and how it applies here. So you have these two devoted disciples of Jesus. They're wonderful disciples of Jesus, and they marry each other. And then what happens sometimes is that in their romance and all of that, the focus begins to go more and more into their devotion, how they devote themselves to each other. And so God begins to kind of get left out. And in the beginning, it kind of works. They're in love, and they're devoting themselves to each other. And at first, it actually satisfies them. It fulfills them. In fact, it's glorious. It's satisfying. But God is being neglected, and individually and together. And what happens is that time goes by, and some dissatisfaction begins to come into the relationship, and then they begin to go, wait a second, what's wrong? My spouse isn't satisfying me. I'm not satisfied in my marriage like I was my first year or my second year or whatever of our relationship. And what it can lead to, it can lead to some discouragement, and sometimes it can lead to some real disillusionment when the day comes and it dawns on them that this other person just isn't everything to me now. So that's one of the mistakes that we can make.
Yeah, the other mistake, the young family mistake. The children come, and certainly they need our devotion and our attention. But again, God gets pushed aside, neglected. The years go by. A devoted home becomes a religious home, beliefs, but not a home filled with God's presence. There is a big difference. Many of you know that John and I became empty nesters. And for many, this can be another surprise when the children leave home. Mom and dad look at each other and go, who are we? where are we? Now that is just the two of us. The truth is, it was never just the two of you. There was another who was allowed to sleep to the fringes of the relationship.
Yeah. Do you see what we're talking about? We're talking about how circumstances in life can, in this 3-person relationship, can begin to push one of the persons, and we're talking about God, to the side, and God begins to get neglected, and lo and behold, we begin to live out the consequences of that. And it's a similar mistake, the career, the work/career mistake, where we begin to pour ourselves into our jobs, and once again, our jobs, our careers, our professions are, bringing home the bread or whatever, putting bread on the table, all those kinds of things. This is important. It takes devotion. It certainly takes devotion. But once again, what can happen in a marriage is all these energies get pushed into this, and God begins to get left out, and tremendous mistakes. Marriage is a covenant of 3. And so all 3 persons in this covenant must be nourished, must be given attention to, must be drawn in. All 3 relationships have to be present always, from the beginning, from the day you say I do until the day when one or both have departed. So we'll move on here and talk a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about covenants and love, and covenants and love. And I want to recommend a book. Doug and Ann recommended a great book called, I think it's called Sacred Marriage. And I want to recommend a book called The Meaning of Marriage by Timothy Keller. The Meaning of Marriage. This is a tremendous book. It's helped us a lot. But covenants and love. So when most people think about love in the context of marriage, what they think about is romance. They think about emotions. They think about feelings. And most people are convinced that this love, this type of love, the romance, the feelings, the emotion, that is going to form the foundation of their marriage relationship from here on out. And so of course that's why they say I do, but they're convinced that love, that romantic love, is going to be the foundation for their relationship from that point forward. But God, it's interesting, when God speaks of love, when God, in the Bible, when God speaks of love, it's not necessarily about how we feel in terms of affection or romance or feelings or desires, or intense emotions or anything like that. It's more in the context of how much am I willing to give of myself to someone else. That's how God looks at love. That's what God is thinking when God talks about love in relationships. So here's some questions. How much are you willing to lose for the sake of your spouse? Another question. How much are you willing to forsake, to give up for the sake of your spouse? And think about it. Think about dreams, goals, time, resources, wants, your freedom. How much are you willing to forsake for the sake of your spouse? Another question. How much are you willing to invest in your spouse? How much are you willing to invest in your spouse? And this, I'm asking you to ask these questions of yourself, because this is where covenants, when they are understood and they're embraced, they're actually brought in and lived out in a relationship. This is where covenants are foundational. This is where covenant forms the foundation of a solid, lifelong marriage. There is a huge difference between the feeling of love and the promise to love. There's a huge difference between the feeling, the emotion of love, and the promise to love someone. A promise, listen to this, a promise takes into account both the unknown and the unpredictable. A promise looks both at the present and also at the future. A promise also looks toward the future. Feelings can only be in the present. They can only be in the present. They have no way of anticipating how they are going to be in some future, because life changes and circumstances change and even people change. The environment that we're living in our marriage right now at this moment in time, it can change. It will change for sure, but it can change in an instant. Anything can happen, and that environment is transformed, and feelings cannot possibly predict how they are going to respond when anything happens, when there's anything, when the future becomes the present, or when any circumstance changes. But a promise can. A promise can. I can promise my spouse that I am going to love her no matter what. I can make that promise, not even knowing what's coming. I can make that promise. And so then the only determining factor, as far as that promise is concerned, the only determining factor becomes whether or not I will be willing to keep that promise. That very promise that I made both to my spouse and that I also made to God. So feelings, people, circumstances, even contracts, as Silvia pointed out earlier, they can all potentially weaken and they can all change, but not covenants. A covenant doesn't change unless God changes. And of course, God doesn't change. Okay, so we're wrapping it up here. I think we still got a few more minutes. So covenants, they bind you and they also set you free. A covenant, it binds you and it sets you free. So covenants, the marriage covenant, it's designed to give each one absolute and complete security and confidence and assurance, so that we can fully express our love to each other and to not hold back, to not be guarded. No more with a covenant, there's no more need for self-preservation. There's no more need for self-protection. And the truth is, before I married Silvia, I I had never been completely vulnerable. I had never given myself fully to another human being. Never. And in marriage, in a marriage covenant, you are both, and this is true, you know this, you are both literally and figuratively naked. You're naked, both literally and figuratively. Even on our honeymoon, it was. And we were talking about this now that we're celebrating our anniversary. It wasn't about just the romance. It wasn't just a whole honeymoon of romance. We started talking. We just started talking about ourselves and opening up and sharing about who we are, and that was part of part of our honeymoon, a huge part of our honeymoon. And honestly, we have never ever stopped that to this day.
Yeah, and that is one of the reasons God is pleased with marriage among Christians. In a Christian marriage, our confidence in each other is due ultimately to our confidence in God. We believe that our spouse responds to God's authority, and that our spouse abides in God's will. I married John trusting him with my life because I trusted he was first surrendered to God, which would allow him to take good care of God's daughter, me. Now, I say this, starting this way doesn't secure a happy marriage forever. Our surrender to God must be a decision that we make continuously. Otherwise, we can lose the trust and our confidence and the freedom to express our love.
Yeah, thank you. So, a marriage covenant, it's designed to give us absolute security and assurance. But it's also designed to help us give of ourselves unconditionally to each other. And this is important to understand because the marriage covenant, like other biblical covenants, they're patterned after God's covenants with us. That's what they're patterned after. So if you want to understand a covenant, and you want to see the power and the beauty of a covenant, what a covenant does as far as just being able to give oneself unconditionally to the other, all you need to do is look at God and his covenant with us. That God's the example in all of this. So, and this is something you guys can, you can think about and meditate on for further study, but just think about it in our covenant relationship with God. When we sin, what does Jesus do? When we're unfaithful, when we disappoint, when we pull back, when you could fill in the blank, when we whatever, what does Jesus do? How does God respond to all of this? And of course, what we see is God is constantly, oftentimes in spite of us, he's constantly committed to the protection and the nourishing and the healing and the strengthening and the repairing and all of that of our relationship, of his relationship with his people. And so he's the example of what a covenant relationship looks like. And because of that, as he invests himself in our marriage, in our covenant relationship with that same spirit, he expects and empowers Silvia and I to do the same. That's the expectation. That's what covenant sort of mandates, that we give ourselves unconditionally to one another in this relationship.
Mm-hmm. Our marriage relationship is a mirror of our relationship with God. There is a parallel between marriage and walk with God. If you are strong in your relationship with God, you be strong in your marriage. Be strong in your marriage doesn't mean your marriage is perfect. It means you are holding strongly and faithfully to your marital vows. persevering with patience and wisdom. When we are not walking with God, the trials of a marriage life, two sinners living together, will get the best of you. Far from God, unconditional love, trust, and peace are much more difficult to find in ourselves.
Our last point, and this is, this is kind of a serious one. They're all serious, but this one, this is a biggie. So covenant, when God is involved, it means obedience. Covenant, when God is involved, it means obedience. When we enter into a marriage covenant with each other and with God, we do so understanding that we are going to obey God. We are going to obey his word. We're going to seek his will. We're going to seek his counsel. God is going to guide and monitor and mold this relationship. We are going to obey God. And it's an obedience. It's an obedience that's based on trust. I mean, it's the same trust that motivated Silvia, motivated me to become Christians in the first place, in our individual covenant relationship with God. We trusted God, and so we obeyed him, and now we enter into covenant with him in marriage, and we continue with that decision. In our marriage, we are going to obey God. Obeying God is foundational in building our marriage together. And I have said this, and many of you have heard me say this. I've said this to some of you. Obedient Christians have good marriages. Sometimes it's that simple. Obedient Christians who are obedient to God, they have good marriages. I am a minister. I am not a marriage counselor. I'm a minister. Now, I counsel marriages, but I counsel marriages as a minister. So what do ministers do? Well, ministers call people into a relationship with God. Ministers call people into obedience to God. Ministers remind people of their covenant relationship with God and the promises that they made to God. And they call them to be faithful to those promises. Ministers call people to repentance. Ministers call people to walk faithfully with God. Ministers call people to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ. And so I say this to disciples of Jesus who are married. I'm talking about sincere followers of Jesus. Now, we're not perfect. Silvia will say something about this in a second. Nobody's perfect, but to sincere followers of Jesus who are married, I, as a minister, I can help them repair or strengthen their marriage. I can do that. Why? Because most marriages are weakened or broken because of sin. We know that. We've all been married. We are married. So I can help, as a minister, point people back to God. And God will work to help repair that marriage. But for those who refuse or resist obedience to God and his word, I honestly don't have much else to offer, except for my prayers and honestly, my deep concern.
Now, we have witnessed couples losing the battle in their marriage because one or both didn't want to enter into war against their own sin. We have witnessed also couples that are living examples of God's transformative power due to their faith, surrender, and love for God. One of the most amazing things witnessing miracles like this is to see how these disciples come out of the transformation. They start to share the blessings, to share with others what God did in their lives. They start to help others also to be transformed by God. They become a lighthouse for the lost, for other couples that are in need of hope. There is a parallel between marriage also and evangelism. Good marriage glorify and serve God in a powerful way. God marriages just don't happen naturally. We are sinners. Our love for God will be tested by our obedience to Him. This means for us sinner to have good marriage, we need to take to heart and put into practice all help we receive as we strive to live as obedient children of God.
So, good disciples, great disciples, sincere followers of Jesus are going to have good marriages, and I really believe that when we find ourselves, in our marriage stagnant or troubled, often the place to start, as far as repairing that marriage, the place to start is looking at me and my own obedience to God, and starting there, restoring my obedience to God, and then watching what God is going to do with that. So we've talked about covenants tonight, and we've talked about covenant being a pillar, being foundational. Silvia and I have, this is, like we said, this is a big deal for us. And I guess the last thing I'll say about covenants is that when you look at covenants, God's covenants, He seals them in blood. God's covenant with us was sealed in blood, his own blood. And so when you enter into covenant with your spouse, think about this. If when you enter into covenant with your spouse, you are willing to die, your marriage will live. As we live out covenant relationship, God, husband, wife, if we are willing to die, God certainly is, our marriage will live. So I hope what we've shared has been helpful with you all. Like I said, I will post tomorrow some thoughts for reflection, discussion that we hope, as couples, you'll be able to look at and talk about until we meet again next Wednesday. In the meanwhile, I am going to celebrate my 31st anniversary.
Amen.
Congratulations.
Thank
you.
you.
And thank you, guys. Congratulations.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary. Thank you.
Thanks for letting us share in your
Thank you,
anniversary.
Silvia and John.
Silvia.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Anniversary.
Congratulations.
Sylvia, we love you.
You guys are beautiful.
Love
Thank
you guys.
you. You guys are awesome. It was great.
Love you guys. Bye.
You know-
Happy anniversary.
Sylvia just mentioned something. If you guys have any questions,